Welcome to the Double Blonde Brokers podcast. With this podcast, our hope is that clients and friends alike can learn something. With each episode, we make light of the complexity of health insurance by offering tips, tricks, vocab lessons, and even sharing stories of our experiences as brokers. New episodes launch every Wednesday.
Well, welcome for our third episode of the Double Blonde Brokers. And today we have a very exciting topic to talk about. But first, I want to introduce myself, Suzanne O'Connor, and the other half of the Double Blonde Broker, Emily Keaton. So today we're going to talk about Part D, prescription drug plans. We talked about that a little bit last week at the end of episode 2 and promised that we would discuss that further today because it's got enough stuff. So I'm going to let Emily kind of give you a big overview of it, and then we'll start breaking it down and see how we can be of help to you learning about it.
So it became an issue where prescriptions were getting more and more expensive. We all know Big Pharma and they kind of control everything. So prescriptions were getting more and more expensive. People were struggling to pay for them, and legislation kept going back and forth and couldn't make a decision. So eventually in 2006, they decided this is something we really got to pass, got it going. And there's kind of two different ways now that you can get coverage for that Part D, either a true Part D standalone drug plan, or in a lot of Advantage plans, they include that Part D in there as well. And something we kind of want to touch on too is that there is also a late enrollment penalty if you decide to kind of delay starting your drug coverage or just don't get a drug plan and then decide to get one later. My mom's a good example of this. If she doesn't take any prescriptions, super healthy, and she said to me, "What do I need a drug plan for?" And you may think, yeah, I don't need one. But if you don't start it when you first start your Medicare, then you will be fined for it later. You'll have a late enrollment penalty. And, on top of that, you just never know when you will start taking a drug. So it could be middle of the year and you need something, and we got to make sure that's in place so that you can get what you need when you need it.
We never know what's ahead, right? So that's all about what Part D kind of is. But Part D is structured a little different. We explained last time about deductibles and co-insurance and things like that with the medical side. And Part D has its own thing, but they're called the stages. So there's 4 stages with Part D. And so the overall view is there's a deductible stage, then there's an initial coverage phase, and then there is the coverage gap phase, also known as the donut hole, and then the catastrophic. So we're going to break that down because I'm sure everybody's going like, well, what does all that mean, right? So everybody's kind of they're familiar with a deductible, right? And usually deductible means you have to pay that out of your pocket first before the insurance company starts paying. Well, in this case with Part D, for this year anyway, for 2024, our deductible is $545. So the first $545, you are responsible for the full cost of the drug until after you get out of that phase. Now, with the exception to that, many of the plans have some tiers, like tier 1. A lot of them are tier 1, but some of them are even tier 1 and tier 2, where the deductible doesn't apply. They call that, it's like waived for those particular drugs. So instead of having to pay the full cost of the drug up to the $545, you only have to pay the copay amount, which could be $0 or $1 or $5 or very minimal amounts. And a lot of drugs fall into those categories. So for very many people, those costs of those drugs are very low cost. But for some of those that are a little bit higher tier drugs, all of a sudden you get an antibiotic and you're used to paying $0 and $1 and you get an antibiotic prescribed to you or something like that. And it's not a tier 1 and tier 2. And the full cost of that drug is going to kick in then and go towards your deductible. And so you may have a little sticker shock when you go and find out that you're owing $200-$300 or something like that for the cost of this drug. So, but all those prices, it is a little confusing, but even though you're only paying a smaller amount for those drugs, the full cost of the drug goes towards your deductible. So that's what we're trying to meet in the beginning, that $545. And after that, then we're going to be going into a different way. It's going to be being covered by either coinsurance or a copay. So I'm going to send that on over to Emily, and she's going to explain the next phase, the initial coverage phase.
Yeah, so the initial coverage phase, you are in kind of the sweet spot of paying a copay for all of your drugs pretty much. So you still get those generics for those copays, but then those name brand drugs, like, say you've got an expensive inhaler or something, you'll start getting a copay for that drug as well. So good place to be. Your drugs are covered pretty well. And then so like Suzanne said, all of those costs of that drug are adding up, adding up, adding up. So beyond that deductible of the 545, we now are adding up until we get to what is called that initial coverage phase kind of limit. And that is $5,030, which sounds like a lot of money. But some of those inhalers, diabetic drugs, they're like $600 a month. So you can get there depending on what you're taking kind of quickly.
Yeah.
Some people never get there if they have really inexpensive drugs. But once we get to that amount, we fall into kind of that elusive donut hole that everybody talks about. So, yeah, you think about a donut, right? And you're eating that donut on one side of it and it's real tasty, and you kind of fall into the center of that donut, or think a bagel too, same kind of thing. And there's nothing in there. Your coverage isn't as good. Your donut isn't as good. They plucked it out and threw it somewhere else, selling somebody donut holes. Um, and we kind of think about that in our drug plan as like, we start with this pretty good coverage, and then all of a sudden we kind of fall into this hole and it's not so sweet anymore. And when you're in that hole, which is also known as the coverage gap, you are now going to start paying 25% of the cost of all of your drugs. So, that $400 to $600 drug that you've been taking all of a sudden becomes really expensive. Maybe you were paying a $40 copay and now you're paying, $150 every month. So that can get quite expensive. You can understand why a lot of people, when they talk about the donut hole, they're like, oh God, the donut hole, this sucks.
Yeah.
And it does for a lot of people.
It does.
And it's kind of wonky because it's very backwards from traditional insurance.
And, I think, in relationship to that, the way a drug could be covered during those three phases. In the deductible phase, let's just say, like you mentioned, an inhaler, it's, $300 and it's going to go toward the cost of your full paying, the full part in the deductible. And then when it moves down to this initial coverage phase, and now you pay $47 for it, right? And you're like, oh, that's nice. And then all of a sudden now you get into the donut hole, and then that drug is now going to be, whatever, $100 or whatever, a little less, but whatever, 25% of the full cost of the drug, that's what you're paying. So that's why it's so confusing. It's like, I went from, 300 to 47 to 85, and you're always all over the place. And it really depends on, and we can't even tell you that exactly, because it's when you actually purchase those drugs, when that full cost of the drug is going toward those amounts, is whenever it comes up, so it's like, it's very, very difficult to, to try to fathom what this is going to be like. This is, one of the more intricate parts of Medicare that's not so predictable, is in your drug costs. But then we do get to the other side of that, and then we are into the catastrophic phase. Once you reach that 8,000, between that five, after you're in that coverage, that's between 5,030 and 8,000. That's when the hole is. But then after that, you get into another sweet spot on the other side of the donut, right?
Right.
And then drugs cost zero. Absolutely zero.
So they eventually stop the bleeding.
They do.
So they are still making improvements. We think about it, it's 2006 isn't that long ago. It's still relatively new program, and constantly trying to make it better. So, kind of one of the other things to talk about, just kind of as an example of where this gets really, really confusing, is diabetic drugs.
Yeah.
So they kind of fall even into another category of some diabetic drugs are on this list that they've created, like Humalog is one, Novolog, different types of insulin, that they don't really even apply to that donut hole situation. You get those for a lower copay all year long. Um, but it's not all the insulins and it's not all the diabetic drugs. So that gets confusing as well. But kind of one big thing to point out is that when you take a diabetic, for example, if there is a prescription that you pick up from the actual pharmacy, that's going to be covered under your Part D plan. And then if you pick up the drug, say from a diabetic supplies place or things like your sensors, different types of equipment that's used for being diabetic, those things are actually going to fall under your Part B. So, like Dexcom sensors are they can be quite expensive. A lot of those are going to fall under the Part B, which is original Medicare rather than this drug plan. So, if you get it at a pharmacy, Part D drug, and if you don't, Part B.
Right. Now, just to kind of give people a little hope too, if you do have very expensive drugs and the income, there is low income subsidy available for people for help with higher cost drugs, and that is income based, and it's usually offered through your state. Now, just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, just to let you know that not all drugs are going to be covered on the formularies, right? And so sometimes we're able to use something like GoodRx alongside of our regular prescription drug plan all the time. I know I do it myself personally. Many people do. So when I go to the pharmacy, I recommend that people check for one, what it costs with their prescription coverage. That's if they can do that and it's affordable, great. If not, tell them to look what it is under GoodRx, because many times those drugs may be in a tier that isn't covered with the deductible not applied. And so, you can get a $300 drug for $40. I know I do that myself. And I have another, and like my thyroid medicine is no longer not a brand name that they cover, but it's affordable on GoodRx. So I use both. Many people do. So don't be afraid to use something like goodrx.com alongside. A little plug for them. We don't get anything for talking about them, but it's something that
but they sure do make our lives easier.
They sure do. So, and then we're gonna wrap it up a little bit, but so when do the phases start over again?
Oh, yeah. Well, and Susie, and one other thing I want to add to what you just said is, along with kind of toying with GoodRx, is check what pharmacy you're going to.
Yeah.
Sometimes Walgreens is cheaper with your drug plan than CVS. They all have preferred pharmacies, standard pharmacies. They've
Absolutely.
even
Yeah.
got some that are not in network at all. And
Right.
so people question why their drugs are so expensive. And, if you're okay with going down the street to somewhere else, it may be a lot cheaper there too. Um, but so to answer your question, everything restarts beginning of the year.
That's why I think it's always so important. This is where a broker can really help, right? Because every year
Absolutely.
formularies change. Every different company has a different formulary. Every year your drugs may change. Some years may not. But even if your drugs haven't changed, the formularies very well may have. The premiums have changed. So, it's one thing that we do offer as a service is to be able to help people navigate that part, even though they're very satisfied with the medical portion, it's the drug thing that really changes more than anything. So great. Well, we're wrapped up Part D. So next time, our subject is going to be the age-old battle of what is better, Medicare Supplement or Medicare Advantage.
If you liked what you heard or learned something new, then feel free to give us a like and a follow. Also, don't be afraid to share us with a friend or write us a review, and you can follow us on all social media platforms. We are on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram as @DoubleBlondeBrokers. You can also send us an email to doubleblondebrokers@gmail.com if you have any suggestions for future episodes or would like to use us as your brokers. Thanks so much for stopping by. We'll see you next time.